They
when they began to build the college.
Yeah, when they began to build the college, a young lawyer was a member of the Christian church in Indiana, and he had become friends with a Welsh preacher that had moved to Miram and was beginning to preach, and he started a school. They didn't have a high school in Miram then, so he started an academy in the old courthouse. Miram was the old courthouse for the area was about 5 of what we call now counties. And so it was a large area. It was the first major place from Vincennes going north. Wow. And Fort up at Terre Haute came later and established a military fort there to protect from the Indians. But in that time frame, this Welshman began to think. He had graduated from Edinburgh in Scotland, believed very much in education, and he began by going around all of the churches saying, education is a good thing. It may help you. And he began to encourage communities to start academies and to get teachers. Well, they had started one in Miram, and he and his wife were the first 2 teachers of it. And because the old courthouse was standing there, it was a 2-story building, brick building, that had been built as the county seat of Sullivan County. And then it moved to the center of the state, of the county, over in Sullivan. So they left the courthouse here and sold it to the town. And did you have a comment?
Uncle Paul, about what year was this?
What the year of this was in 1850, I think. Okay. In around that area at the time, and so
before the Civil War.
It was before the Civil War. And he and his wife were the 2 teachers, and then he asked his nephew to come, who had also been educated some, and began to teach the students in the academy. And students from Illinois, they did not, usually there were just schools up to the 8th grade. If you wanted to go longer, you kept going, but the 8th grade was as far as you got on it as far as content, unless they did it. So the need of a college was very much. Well, the Buffs, John Buff, had married a lady from the Virginia area out of the aristocracy of that part. That's how come you have the blood of some 5 presidents in you, because they came out of Virginia, and all of those people in Virginia were about related. And so she was of that clan or that whole batch, and so she, when she married John Buff, why, her husband had died and she had a child, and back at that time, nobody was going to take a woman and a child and marry him. Well, John Buff did. And he was a very capable man, but he believed very much in the church, became a great churchman, and his second oldest son, N.G. Buff, Nathaniel was his first name, and that Nathaniel kind of still drags through our family. Henry Nathaniel, and then on down. And so that whole process, that second son was a lawyer. But he had been so convinced by his family, his parents, and so on, we need a place for there to be a college established. And the people, the Welch couple who started the academy in Miram, were very much for that. And so they all went the state of Indiana to encourage Indiana starting a college
The Christian denomination.
of the Christian denomination, and communities wanted the college to be built there, but they said, well, if we want it, let's see how much money you'll put up and what kind of a land you'll give for it to be. And it turned out a lot of them gave some swampland and raised a little money. The most any town other than Mirram raised was $10,000, and it wasn't secure. But in the town of Mirram, they gave the old courthouse, but they also raised $35,000, which was a whale of a lot of money back then. And so you know where the college was built. In Mirram. Even though, towns like Richmond or Logansport or other towns in Indiana that vied for it, they didn't put up much. So this young guy, known as Nathaniel Guptill Buff, an attorney, he became the secretary of the founding committee, as well as on the staff of the new college to be, and they hired one of the sharpest men that they knew of, came back from Iowa to become the first president of the college. And they began with, now notice, in 1 year, they incorporated, they selected the site, they raised the funds, and started to build in 1 year. Well, I've been in this building business with churches, and you can hardly get an outhouse built in 1 year.
So they were more than navel gazers.
Yes, they were. They were committed people and eager for it. And the family, the Springer family, owned that field that was planted in corn. And when they started to build the church, they didn't have all the corn out yet, or to build the college building, but they donated the land for the college. And so Mirram raised over $35,000.
So why did they have so much money here?
Why did they have so much money? They had the old courthouse. They had 2 slaughterhouses down over the hill, down over the bluff, for slaughtering hogs. They built an awful lot of the boats, the flat boats, to carry it on down to New Orleans. And they had great, beautiful tulip poplar trees, which made the best flat boats that you could get. Well, they built New Orleans out of the good Indiana poplar. When they got their boats down, they couldn't drag them back up, so they sold them for lumber, took them apart and sold them the lumber, and they built the houses in New Orleans out of them. And I'm sure that it's still, some of that poplar is still there. And so it was because of that, but we also had my great grandfather, Buff, John Buff, had been a very excellent farmer and had saved his money and educated his family. And he bought this farm here. When the college was decided to be built here, he wanted his family to be educated. So he bought the property and moved here. Well, his oldest daughter was evidently very attractive, at least was attractive to Henry Gettinger, old Henry Gettinger. He's the one, not my dad, but was of the Gettinger family that lived in Connersville area, and so they bought the farm next. So where Jack lives is the Henry Gettinger farm, the old Henry Gettinger, and this was the John Buff farm that the Berries bought after the son of the original Buffs had this farm, and he sold it. They wanted to go to Florida, and they sold it to the Berries, who were the banker. He was the banker in Mirram, If you go to town, the post office has above it Miram State Bank, and that was the bank in Miram. And so because the Buffs had moved here, why they had a number of kids, so the Gettingers wanted to move for an education for their kids, and so they moved and were able to buy the farm next to the Buffs, and so that's how the family got here. They were the only Gettingers that left the Connorsville at that time, and to move over here. The Henry Gettinger had married the oldest daughter of the Buffs. Well, when John Buff died, he left the farm here to his eldest son. And the back 80, he left, this was a little over 200 acres at that time that he had. And he left the last 80 to his daughter that was married to Henry Gettinger. And so from the Sand Hill, which is the two fields beyond our line, was given to Henry Gettinger's farm, and that's how it was moved there. And
so the fields to the north of the pond, they used to belong to the Buff farm.
Yes, it was part of the bluff. And the one behind it, the sand field beyond it, those two layers of fields. They laid out most fields at that time in 20 acres. And because that was, with horses, you didn't want to get it too long because you didn't want to hurt your horses. You wanted to be able to rest your horses at each end of the row. And so you wanted, they found that it didn't tire the horses out too badly if you made it a 20-acre field, that they could do so. Well, in any case, the college became very active. John Buff, who lived here, was bought stock in it. It was a stock college. People bought stock in it, and if you had enough stock, so much stock, why, you could send your kids there free, for their tuition was free. And so they both had and John Buff's grandkids came to live here so they could go to the college because he had stock in the college and they could go tuition free. And they could live with him. And and the same with the Henry Gettinger family. So they all of our family from that point on went to college. I mean, you didn't, that wasn't a question of what you did. When I grew up, you know, I got out of high school. Well, what's next? I knew what was next, college. Well, my college was gone, so I hitchhiked out to Doane College in Nebraska, you know, with my application in my pocket. And the dean said, Paul, how come you didn't send your application in? How do you know that we would accept you? You want students, don't you? You know, the college here was always looking for students. I knew the way the thing worked. He laughed and said, yeah, we want students, but I don't have your grades or anything. I thought colleges wanted students. I wanted to get an education. So the dean never forgot me. He needed a cheerleader. I'd gone out for football, but I was working a morning job. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I was to be down at the creamery to work there. And the second week of it, I had got up and got dressed and walked out and got down off of the college property, and somehow I mysteriously got back in bed. So I knew I couldn't play football and work. I liked football better than working, but it didn't pay the bill. So I had to quit football. And, but relationship to the college has always been much of the family. John Buff was on the original board of directors of the college. Henry Gettinger, who was a minister in the Christian church, as well as a farmer, because the Christian church thought, you didn't have to be full-time in the church. You could work a farm and support yourself, and he could go across on the ferry and walk the way to the church and come back. Spend all day that he could visiting the people and being with them. And so that was the process. But Henry Gettinger, he both. So the family, from its beginning, has always had somebody on the board of Union Christian College, Miriam Institute, and the Miriam Conference Center. I just have resigned from it, from the board, and I've asked that the board would ask Steve if they would go on. So
Jack is still on, isn't he?
Jack is still on, and it's my dad was always on the board, and Grandpa was on the board. When the college closed, it's interesting how the family worked, and you can say what you want about the stubborn Gettingers, but they pay off. George, who was a judge in Sullivan County, George Buff, was my grandpa's uncle. And they lived here. He was the judge. He was on the board. Had the stock of great-grandpa Buff, John Buff, and John L. was on the board because he had most of the stock of Henry Gettinger. He had bought.
John L. Gettinger.
John Gettinger, yeah. And he had bought the home farm. And he was a builder of houses. He built the school in Miriam, high school, grade school. He built the roads out across the country. And it is said William Jennings Bryan came here to speak at Chautauqua. And he came twice, 2 different times, and Grandpa and Grandma had him out to dinner each time. And he was, I think, one time was before he was elected president, and the other time was after he had been president.
Nominated.
Nominated, now. Yeah, ran for president, wasn't president. And it said that Grandpa they had all been Republicans because of the Civil War. My Henry Gettinger went off to the Civil War as a chaplain. And the president of the college also went to war in the Civil War as a chaplain too. So for almost the total length of the Civil War, they were as chaplains in the Civil War. Well, and during that time, the college had a hard struggle with the president gone and from it, but it did hang on. During that time, we had supposedly a very enterprising man who lived on the island out in the Wabash River, in the middle of it, just north. And he was known as a
thief.
Horse thief.
Horse thief, yeah. And he came up here because he knew that there was just a wife there. Her husband was off to the war. And he said, I need your horses and your cattle. What he was doing was stealing all the horses and cattle from all the farmers who didn't have a man to protect them. And she said, well, they're not for sale. Oh, I didn't intend to buy them. I just intended to take them. And he said, do you look up at that window up there? There's a sun up there with a 22 aimed right at your head. And if you look over there, there's another son standing at that corner up there in the upstairs with a gun, aiming at your friend's head. He decided he was going someplace else. So she did not lose her farm or any cattle. And because she had older sons that were old enough to protect and take care of things on it, while the husband was away in the Civil War. But the Civil War, there were an awful lot of people who were for the South. So they were called Copperheads by the people who were for the North. They didn't call themselves Copperheads. But they threatened to burn the college building down.
Why?
Because the college was for the North.
Yeah.
And these were Southern sympathizers. And anything that the college kind of had a real influence on people. And around the whole region, Illinois and Indiana. And because it had a number of these Christian churches scattered around, and so it built some animosity. But when they came back, the guy who was the thief in the island was. Do we have more chairs, or are they going on out?
They're coming in.
We need a chair.
We're an hour different over there.
Oh.
Sorry.
Oh, well, that's all right.
That's
All of our
right.
phones had 2:30.
Yeah. Pull up a chair.
Hard to get used to all the clock changing.
Must have been on
Yeah,
the other side
right.
of the river.
I'll talk long enough.
The towers were from the other
So-
side.
Yeah. And so when the soldiers came back from the war, why, the wives had told them about so-and-so who had stolen a lot of the horses and sold them to either the North or the South, because horses were very important. And he made quite a bit of money. And he had a wife with him known as Mary, supposedly. And so the guys who had been in the Civil War decided that they would needed to kind of eliminate a thief. And they went and captured him, burned down his house on the island, and
Lengthened his neck.
well, it was the last of him. He was no longer a threat to the people of his stealing stuff. And every family had a different story. I've said, because our story was that Grandpa, Henry Gettinger, who was a minister, went with him and had a prayer over him as he dumped him in the river. And tied up. Yeah. Others say that they shot him, everybody shot him before they put him in the river. That you get all kinds, every story, every family had their own story that had come from their parents, because nobody was to really know who did it. Because the sheriff, I'm sure the sheriff wondered what happened, but I don't think he was too concerned. From there I'm going to move a little quicker into the family now down. John L. got the family farm here. There weren't other boys, but there were. But for some reason, he began to farm it and to buy it, and had the farm.
That's your grandpa.
That's my grandpa, John L. Yeah. And he had his oldest daughter had married an engineer and an architect. He was an architect and engineer both. And he began to draw plans up for buildings, and Grandpa bid on them and got many of the bids, and he drew up the plans for the building of the roads, and Grandpa bought all of this big equipment. As a kid, I saw all these scoops that had big wheels. The wheels were up about this high. I don't know if any of you have ever handled a scoop, not a scoop shovel, but a scoop that had two handles, and the two horses pulled it, and you put the scoop would scoop up a quarter of a yard of dirt, and it would slide it up, and then it'd dump it to build a pond or whatever you were doing with it. Well, these were big scoops. If you didn't watch what you were doing, or you hit a root, you could fly across the scoop right in the aiming at the back legs of the horses or the mules, whatever you want.
That would not end well.
That would not be nice, no. But in any case, he built an awful lot of the roads. Well, I've talked a little bit about William Jennings Bryan. It was said that the one story is of why Grandpa changed from being a Republican, because he was for the Union in the Civil War, and the Democrats were all for the South at that moment in this area. And it was said that he became a Republican, a Democrat from being a Republican because of his listening to William Jennings Bryan when he was at his table. You know, he came out each time he was here to eat with Grandma and Grandpa. And the other story is he wanted to build roads, and most of the people who voted were Democrats. So the county commissioners who hired the people to build the roads were Democrats, so Grandpa became a Democrat so he could build roads. You take your pick on stories. Oh, but at that relationship, when the college was closing, Grandpa was the secretary, and his uncle, George Buff, was the chairman of the Board of Trustees. They had just had a fundraiser, and George had made a good contribution to it, as well as John L. And I'm sure that Grandpa gave as much as he did, because he was very faithful and giving. And they were talking about the things were bad during the Depression, of what about closing the college and so on. Well, Grandpa didn't want the college to close. He was secretary of the board, and his uncle, George Buff, was the chairman of it. And he wanted the college to close because he wanted his money back. He and his wife were moving to Florida. Well, it ended up, George took him to court, Grandpa and the college to court, and he won. So the college closed. But Grandpa was never satisfied with that. He supported individually, until others were willing to do so, the Dr. Watkins, who was the college was a seminary, the leading seminary of the Christian church in the U.S., and also it was a college and a teacher's normal school, as well as the academy and on it. It was the first college in America where women were treated totally as equals with men. Women, now Oberlin was ahead in terms of how giving women a great deal of respect and responsibility, Oberlin College in Ohio. But here, the women could take every class that a man could take. There were no distinctions. Women didn't have to be secretaries or cooks. They could be anything they wanted to be. And women's rights were highly respected and cherished. And so it had the reputation of that in forward thinking. It took most of the areas another 20 or 30 years to get on board, and some didn't. But that was the background of our family. And every man that went to the college, in my dad's family, married a fellow student. He got his wife or her husband there. And so we had strong women in our immediate family area, and it was and they had all gone to Union Christian College, and it was it only took Mom one semester to turn Dad's eyes. He had been to war and had come back, and he was older. He was almost 24 when Mom and Dad, well, he was 24 when Mom and Dad got married. And and after marriage, they went to Florida.
How old was she?
Mom was 2 years younger than Dad. She had been older. She had gone to school in Indianapolis, Shortridge High School, and then became a bank teller and had worked at that for a good while before she came down to college. And the reason she came to college down at Mirham was they went to the Methodist Church in Irvington, in Chicago, in Indianapolis, and the pastor's wife and the pastor had both come to Union Christian College, and they were sending their daughter down to the college, and they didn't want her to go down to Mirham alone, and they talked Helen, who was, much older, about 3 or 4 years older than Ruth, to go there. But Ruth was Henry's first cousin. And so, first Sunday they went to church, where there was Grandma and Grandpa getting her, and they said, "Oh, Ruth, will you go home to dinner with us?" Ruth said, "Oh, fine, but I've got a friend Helen here who came down from Indianapolis with us. Can she come out to dinner too?" What? Sure. Well, that began the whole courtship. Henry got the horses out to take the girls horseback riding. And Helen was impressed, and evidently Henry was too. So at Christmas time, Dad had gone to college before World War I and had gone there for, I think, 2 years beforehand, and then just one semester afterwards, the war. And he followed Helen home. She took the train, and I don't know how Henry got there, but he got there during the Christmas holidays, and knocked on the door, and they let him in, and he talked to Otto F. Richter, and said to him, "Helen and I I'd like to marry your daughter, and I thought I ought to come and talk to you about it." And Otto said, "Well, what does Helen think?" Well, she was in the kitchen, they were in the dining room, so it wasn't far. Henry said, "Well, I think Helen is willing." I don't know if they asked Helen or not, but I think Otto was just giving him a hard road. But anyway, they said, "Well, if Helen is willing, why we're willing for you to get married. When do you plan that?" "Well, we thought tomorrow." "We're here together, and we'd like to be married by Ruth's parents, who was the pastor of the Methodist Church that the family went to." And so they got married. Well, part of the gift.
They got married tomorrow?
Got married tomorrow. And or whatever was clear for the minister to marry him. I don't for sure on that, but
That was really pretty typical.
yeah. Well, it was amazing. They made up their mind, and they would go to some pastor and to get married.
No big ceremony.
And but the gift from Otto F. Richter was a round-trip ticket to Florida for their honeymoon.
He worked for the railroad.
Yeah, he worked for the railroad. He lost a leg. He was a mechanic on the railroad company, an engineer. And so they went down to Tampa, Pensacola. Well, not Pensacola, to Tampa. and that area, and they kind of liked it there. But Henry ran out of money, but they still had a return ticket. And so he began to look for a job, and he got the job as a foreman in an orange grove. Well, they had a shack in the orange grove where the workers could live, you know. It just had 4 walls with nice ventilation and screens on the windows. And so they bought a table and a bed. They bought a sanitary couch, and I know that unless you saw Grandma's sanitary couch, if you came here to visit her at any time, it was in the hallway in the old house.
Mm.
You probably remember that, Larry,
Yeah,
do you? In the hallway in the old house.
I think so. I'm kind of getting the
Yeah, it had 2 sides. It normally was just like a sofa, only no back to it.
Yeah,
And springs, all metal. And they called it a sanitary couch because you could take all the padding off. It was all loose on top, and wash it. And you could just clean all the metal with a good sterilizing factor. Well, they had a sanitary couch down in Florida. They bought that. They thought that was good. And when, gosh, Mama was not very well educated about the facts of life. But they did get pregnant. I mean, she did. And baby was coming. And they were. Mama said to me once, you know, I didn't know how the baby was going to be born. I knew it was because I'm here. So I came from someplace, and but came time for delivery, and they had a neighbor lady that came, and Dad Henry got on the horse, and he ran to town as fast as he could to find the doctor, and the doctor followed him out, so he was there, and Peggy was born. And they just were doing fine there. Well, gosh, Otto and his wife thought that Henry and Helen ought to bring the baby back and live in Indianapolis. And Grandpa John and Rose thought he ought to come back and work on the farm, and he could live with them and take care of things because that was their grandchild. And so both grandparents were just plugging like all get out to come back to Indiana. And they didn't come. So Otto had free tickets to Florida. So he and his good wife caught the train, and they came down to Florida to see their new baby. Well, they were appalled that they were living in this shack out in the orange grove, you know. They had a house in the city with plumbing and in Indianapolis. Now, it wasn't that way in John L. and Rose's house. They had to walk a path to the outhouse. But it was interesting. But Helen wasn't convinced. They were happy in Florida, stayed. Otto and Elizabeth couldn't figure that out, but they didn't get their grandchild back up, and they were doing just fine. And when winter came, it was after Christmas. Why, they got a telegram. Mom's sick. Stop. Come home. Stop. Dad. Well, they didn't know if Grandma was dying or what, or she had a cold. And but they sold the things and they loaded up and came home. Well, you know what Grandma and Grandpa did? She was sick, and John L. thought she'd get better in Florida than she would on the farm. I needed to hear for Henry to take care of the animals and all the farm, and for for Helen to cook for George. He was still in high school. So they not only had a baby, but they had this teenager to take care of. And and all the cows to milk, and everything, and to begin all the plowing in the spring. So that's how they got back here. Go ahead.
So that was before my mom was even a year old, you think?
Yeah, that was before she was a year old. Aunt Libby had had Rosemary. She was the oldest, and they had a baby, Rosemary. And then Aunt Leone and Uncle Dan had their oldest child, Martha Jane, and they lived across the road in the house where we used to live and where Patty lives now. And so Mom and Dad lived with Grandma and Grandpa upstairs with their baby, and George was upstairs. Grandpa and Grandma lived downstairs. They had their bedroom there. In the wintertime, they moved their bed into the fireplace room to stay warm.
How many years did they live that way?
They lived that way. Well, she became pregnant. Mom did with Nat, Henry, and